My family made me sleep in the garage during Christmas to make room for my cousin. You should be grateful we let you stay, my mom sneered. I left that night without a word. Now my inbox is flooded with panic-filled messages. I, 24M, never thought Christmas would be the day I'd finally understand how little I meant to my family. But sometimes life has a way of showing you exactly where you stand, and mine chose the coldest night of December to deliver that lesson. It started 3 days before Christmas when my mom announced that my cousin would be staying with us for the holidays. She mentioned it casually while I was helping her wrap presents, as if she was discussing the weather. My cousin needed a place to stay because his apartment had flooded, and naturally, our house was the solution. What she didn't mention until 2 days later was that I'd be the one displaced to make room for him. I was carrying my laptop upstairs to my room when I found my mom stripping my bed. My clothes were already in garbage bags by the door, and my desk had been cleared of everything I owned. She looked up at me with that practiced smile she used when she was about to deliver bad news disguised as a favor. She explained that my cousin would need my room since it had the better heating and the private bathroom. I would be sleeping in the garage for the few days he'd be here. She said it like she was offering me a vacation package to somewhere exotic. I stood there, watching her fold my sheets, and asked if there wasn't any other arrangement we could make. Maybe the living room, or even the basement would be better than the garage. The temperature had been dropping below freezing every night. She stopped folding and fixed me with that look I'd grown up seeing whenever I questioned her decisions. She reminded me that this was her house, her rules, and that I should be grateful they were letting me stay at all instead of finding my own place. After all, I was 24 and most kids my age were already living independently. The way she said, letting me stay, hit differently than I expected. I'd been contributing to household expenses since I started working at 19. I paid for my own food, helped with utilities, and even covered some of the mortgage payments when Dad was between jobs last year. But apparently, that was just me being allowed to exist in their space. I didn't argue further. I just took my bags and set up the old air mattress in the garage between Dad's workbench and the water heater. The concrete floor was so cold I could feel it through the mattress, and my breath formed visible clouds every time I exhaled. That first night, I lay there listening to the house settling above me, hearing laughter and conversation drifting down through the ceiling. My cousin had arrived earlier that evening, and the family had ordered pizza to celebrate his visit. Nobody bothered to call me up for dinner. The second night was worse. The temperature dropped even further, and I woke up several times shivering despite wearing every piece of warm clothing I owned. I'd moved the space heater from my old room down to the garage, but it barely made a dent in the cold. Every time I was about to fall asleep, the heater would cycle off and the chill would creep back in. Christmas Eve was when everything fell apart completely. I'd spent the day helping Mom prepare the traditional Christmas Eve dinner, chopping vegetables, and setting up the dining room, while my cousin played video games in my old room. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one doing the work while he got to relax in comfort, but I kept my mouth shut and focused on helping. When dinner time came, I realized there were only 6 place settings at the table for 7 people. I mentioned this to Mom, thinking it was an oversight. She paused in the middle of carrying out the main dish and told me there wasn't enough room at the table with the extra guest. I could eat later, after everyone else was finished. I stood in that doorway watching my family gather around the table without me. My cousin was sitting in my usual spot, and everyone was laughing at some story he was telling about his college friends. Dad was pouring wine, my sister was passing around the bread rolls, and Mom was serving everyone generous portions of the ham I'd spent 2 hours helping her prepare. Nobody looked in my direction. It was like I'd become invisible in my own home. I went back to the garage and sat on my air mattress, listening to the sounds of dinner happening above me. I could hear the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter. At some point, my sister's boyfriend arrived, and there was another round of greetings and excited chatter. Around 9 o'clock, Mom finally brought me a plate with leftovers. She set it on Dad's workbench and told me to make sure I cleaned the plate when I was done. She said it like she was doing me a tremendous favor, bringing me scraps from the family meal. That's when she made the comment about being grateful they let me stay. She was already turning to leave when she said it, tossing the words over her shoulder like they were nothing. Like I was nothing. I looked at that plate of cold ham and congealed gravy, sitting on a dusty workbench in an unheated garage, and something inside me finally snapped. I didn't eat the food. Instead, I quietly packed everything I owned into my car. It didn't take long since most of my belongings were already in garbage bags. I loaded up my clothes, my laptop, my books, and the few personal items that mattered to me. I left the plate untouched on the workbench. The house was quiet when I pulled out of the driveway. Through the living room window, I could see the Christmas tree lights twinkling, and I caught a glimpse of my family watching a movie together on the couch. My cousin was there in the middle of them, already part of their cozy holiday scene. I drove to a 24-hour diner across town and spent Christmas Eve in a booth, drinking coffee and using their Wi-Fi to find a motel room. The desk clerk at the motel seemed surprised that anyone would be checking in on Christmas Eve, but she handed me a key without asking questions. Christmas morning, I woke up in a strange bed and felt more peaceful than I had in months. I ordered room service breakfast and spent the day applying for apartments online. I had enough savings for a deposit and first month's rent, plus a steady job that would cover the ongoing expenses. I turned off my phone and didn't turn it back on until late that evening. 47 missed calls, 63 text messages, 12 voicemails. The panic had started around noon when my family realized I was gone. Mom had apparently gone to the garage to collect the plate and found it untouched, along with my empty air mattress and the space heater. My car was gone from the driveway, and none of my belongings were anywhere in the house. The messages started concerned and quickly escalated to frantic. Mom wanted to know where I was and why I'd left without saying anything. Dad was asking if I was safe and demanding I call them back immediately. My sister sent a string of increasingly worried texts about how everyone was upset and looking for me. But the most telling messages came later in the day. Mom's tone shifted from worry to anger, demanding that I stop being dramatic and come home for Christmas dinner. She said the family was waiting for me and that I was ruining everyone's holiday with my disappearing act. Dad left a voicemail explaining that they'd saved me a plate of Christmas dinner and that my cousin was asking where I was. He said they all missed me and wanted me to come back so they could celebrate together as a family. My sister sent a long text about how my leaving had upset Mom and made everyone's Christmas stressful. She asked what I thought I was accomplishing by running away like a child instead of talking through whatever was bothering me. I read through all of them twice before responding with a single text to the family group chat. I told them I was safe and that I'd be in touch when I was ready to talk. I asked them not to contact me for a while. The messages stopped for exactly 2 hours. Then came the real flood. Mom called me selfish and ungrateful, saying I'd abandoned my family on Christmas over a simple sleeping arrangement. Dad sent angry texts about how I was breaking my mother's heart and acting like a spoiled brat. My sister oscillated between trying to guilt me into coming back and accusing me of being overdramatic about everything. The most interesting message came from my cousin. He said he was sorry if his visit had caused problems and that he'd offered to sleep in the garage instead, but my parents had insisted I wouldn't mind. He seemed genuinely confused about why I'd left and asked if there was something else going on. Update 1. 3 days after Christmas, I signed a lease on a one-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't fancy, but it had heat and I wouldn't have to sleep on concrete. I sent a single text to my parents with my new address and told them I'd be by that weekend to collect anything I'd left behind. The response was immediate and explosive. Mom called me 17 times in 1 hour. When I finally answered, she demanded to know what I thought I was doing and why I was destroying our family over nothing. She said I was being manipulative and cruel, punishing everyone because I didn't get my way about sleeping arrangements. I let her talk until she ran out of steam, then quietly explained that this wasn't about the garage. It was about being treated like an unwelcome guest in what I'd thought was my home. It was about eating leftover scraps alone while the family shared Christmas Eve dinner without me. It was about being told I should be grateful they let me stay, despite contributing financially to the household for years. She went silent for a long moment, then told me I was being too sensitive and that I'd misunderstood everything. Families make sacrifices for each other, and I should have been happy to help accommodate my cousin during his difficult time. When I mentioned that I'd been paying rent and utilities, she said that was just me contributing to the household like any adult should. It didn't entitle me to special treatment or guarantee that nothing would ever change. I hung up after that. Dad showed up at my new apartment 2 days later. He seemed surprised by how nice it was, like he'd expected me to be living in squalor as punishment for leaving. He sat on my couch and looked around at my unpacked boxes, shaking his head like he couldn't understand how things had gotten to this point. He asked why I hadn't just talked to them about being upset instead of disappearing. He said the whole family had been worried sick and that Mom had barely slept since Christmas. He wanted to know what it would take to fix this and get me to come home. I made him coffee and sat across from him, trying to explain that I had tried to talk to them. I'd asked about other sleeping arrangements. I'd questioned the dinner seating. I'd contributed to the household expenses for years. But every time I'd raised a concern, I'd been dismissed or told I should be grateful for what I had. He listened, but I could see in his expression that he didn't really understand. To him, families just figured things out and got through difficult situations together. The fact that I'd felt unwelcome or unvalued seemed genuinely surprising to him. He asked if I'd consider coming to family dinner that Sunday so we could all talk through this together. He promised that everyone would listen and that we could work out a better arrangement for future situations. I told him I'd think about it, but I didn't make any promises. Update 2. I didn't go to Sunday dinner. Instead, I spent the day setting up my apartment and enjoying the quiet. I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist in a space where I didn't have to constantly gauge everyone else's mood or worry about being in the way. The reaction was swift and predictably dramatic. My sister showed up at my apartment Sunday evening, demanding to know why I'd stood the family up after Dad had spent all week talking about how we were going to resolve everything. She was angrier than I'd ever seen her, accusing me of being selfish and cruel. She said Mom had cooked my favorite meal and that everyone had spent the day talking about how to make me feel more included in the family. My absence had turned what was supposed to be a reconciliation dinner into another emotional disaster. I listened to her vent, then asked a simple question: why hadn't anyone thought about including me before I left? She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she shifted tactics and started talking about how families have disagreements, but they work through them together. She said I was punishing everyone for one bad weekend, and that my reaction was completely disproportionate to what had actually happened. I asked her if she'd ever been excluded from Christmas Eve dinner or told she should be grateful to live in her childhood home. She said that was different because she'd never caused problems or made unreasonable demands. That's when I realized she genuinely didn't see the problem. In her mind, I'd been asked to make a small sacrifice for family harmony, and my reaction was childish and excessive. The fact that I'd felt devalued and excluded wasn't something she could comprehend because she'd never experienced it herself. She left after an hour of circular arguments, warning me that I was burning bridges I might someday need to cross again. 2 weeks later, my cousin reached out directly. He'd apparently been asking questions about what had really happened during his visit, and some of the details he'd learned had bothered him. He wanted to meet for coffee and apologize in person. We met at a neutral location, and he immediately started explaining that he'd had no idea about the family dynamics he'd walked into. He'd thought I was staying in the garage by choice, maybe because I wanted privacy or didn't want to be disturbed by his presence. Nobody had mentioned that I'd been displaced or that I was sleeping on concrete without proper heat. He said he'd specifically asked my parents if his visit was causing any inconvenience, and they'd assured him that everyone was happy to accommodate him. When he'd noticed I wasn't at Christmas Eve dinner, Mom had told him I preferred to eat alone and that I was antisocial by nature. He looked genuinely upset as he talked, apologizing repeatedly for unknowingly participating in what he now realized was a pattern of treatment that went far beyond his visit. He'd been talking to other family members and friends, trying to understand the situation, and several people had mentioned that they'd always noticed how differently I was treated compared to my sister. The apology meant something, but it also highlighted how completely my immediate family had rationalized their behavior. They'd managed to make my displacement seem reasonable, and my reaction seemed dramatic, even to an outside observer who'd been directly involved. Update 3. 3 months have passed since I moved out, and the family dynamics have settled into a new pattern. Mom calls once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, and we have carefully neutral conversations about work and weather. She doesn't mention me coming home anymore, but she also doesn't acknowledge that anything was wrong with how things played out. Dad stops by occasionally, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood. He brings peace offerings, my favorite coffee, a book he thought I'd like, updates about family friends. We talk more easily than Mom and I do, but there's an underlying sadness to our interactions, like he knows something fundamental has changed but doesn't quite understand what or how to fix it. My sister has moved through the stages of grief about our relationship. The anger phase lasted about 6 weeks, during which she sent periodic texts about how I was tearing the family apart and being unnecessarily stubborn. The bargaining phase involved invitations to family events with promises that things would be different. Now we seem to be in a kind of resigned acceptance where we exchange birthday wishes and holiday greetings, but don't really talk about anything meaningful. The most unexpected development has been how other people have reacted to the story. My cousin apparently shared what he'd learned with some extended family members, and several relatives have reached out to me directly. An aunt told me she'd always noticed that I seemed to get treated differently during family gatherings, but had assumed it was just birth order dynamics. An uncle mentioned that he'd wondered why I was never included in certain family trips or celebrations that my sister attended. It's been validating to hear these perspectives, but also somewhat painful to realize that the family dysfunction I'd normalized was visible to others who'd chosen not to intervene. The strangest part of this whole experience has been discovering who I am when I'm not constantly managing family relationships or walking on eggshells to avoid conflict. I'd spent so many years adapting to their expectations and trying to earn my place in the family hierarchy that I'd lost track of my own preferences and boundaries. Living alone has been a revelation. I can eat dinner when I'm hungry without coordinating with anyone else's schedule. I can have friends over without checking if it's convenient for the household. I can make decisions about my space and my time without running them past a committee of people who might disapprove. The financial aspect has been easier than expected too. Without contributing to my parents' household expenses, I actually have more disposable income despite paying full rent. I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle more than I'd realized, which makes Mom's comments about being grateful they let me stay even more ridiculous in retrospect. I've started dating someone I met through work, and explaining my family situation to her has been illuminating. She listened to the Christmas story with increasing disbelief, asking questions that helped me see just how abnormal the whole situation really was. Her family has their own dysfunction, but the idea of making a family member sleep in an unheated garage during winter weather genuinely shocked her. The relationship with my parents isn't beyond repair, but it would require them to acknowledge that their treatment of me was problematic. Based on our interactions over the past few months, I don't think they're capable of that level of self-reflection. They've constructed a narrative where I overreacted to a minor inconvenience, and admitting otherwise would require examining years of similar incidents they've rationalized away. I'm not angry anymore, which surprised me. The initial hurt and resentment have faded into something more like indifference. I hope they're happy and healthy, but I don't feel obligated to prioritize their comfort over my own well-being anymore. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just endured that Christmas and continued living in their house, accepting whatever treatment they offered and staying grateful for the privilege. I probably would have remained stuck in those patterns indefinitely, never quite feeling secure or valued, but never quite able to articulate why. Leaving that night turned out to be one of the best decisions I've ever made. It wasn't dramatic or vengeful. It was just finally choosing myself after years of being chosen last. And while my inbox isn't flooded with panic-filled messages anymore, the silence is actually much more peaceful than the chaos ever was.